Hey, how's it going, my friends? So let's continue. This is Reading Out Loud, and this is Chapter 8 of Kenneth Minogue and Lord Lebed, and let's go for it. But the representative function of the politician begins long before policies emerge. It is a skill of constructing a position which will appeal to many people because you can harmonize conflicting desires. The superficiality critic of politicians can see the vagueness and interminacy, which are certainly often necessary for this, but generally fail to appreciate the trick of finding some essence of a issue that can unite different opinions. A skillful politician resembles a magician in his capacity to set object before mind of one's audience while keeping invisible to others, sometimes in the same hole. Simple-minded rationalists sometimes stigmatize this characteristic of politicians and nothing but support-seeking duplicity, and journalists have taken to decode the speeches and disclose the supposed message behind their words. Better understood, this technique is that tact which allows people with different judgments and preferences to live together in one society where it fails, as for example in a difficulty Canadian politicians have in projecting a Canada that would accommodate Francophone and Anglophone opinion. Then society moves to the brink of dissolution. American politicians finessed the division over slavery for as long as they could, for they suspected that the real alternative was civil war, and they were right. Constrained by his representative function, the politician is further circumscribed by the responsibility of his office. The raw brutalities of power are largely converted into the suavities of authority, and it's important to distinguish between the two phenomena. I'm gonna stop right there and ask you guys a question. 1 minute. Continue, and I wrote the question, the difference between power and authority, underneath on the comment section on the sidebar, so that you guys can answer on the comments. So let's continue. The outsider is often impressed by the power of those who hold important positions in the state, but power, while attractive as some kind of melodrama, is mostly exaggerated. The office of a prime minister or president, constitutionally limited, and idealists quickly find that their capacity to improve the world requires a whole stream of concessions they would prefer not to make. As Harry S. Truman remarked, about the biggest power the president has is the power to persuade people to do what they ought to do without having to be persuaded. The power of an office is merely a skill by which a ruler can use his authority to get the right things done. Otherwise, when people talk of power, they merely mean the pleasure an office holder may get from purely personal exercise of will, which is basically a trivial thing. Most trivial of all is the pleasure of being in a constant focus of public places and the capacity to please but also frustrate the ambitious people by whom the politician is surrounded. It can no doubt be exploited for illicit purposes. So, alright. So pretty much what Minogue is saying, that you have authority and you can influence people, but in order to pass laws you need a lot of concessions. I feel this works mostly with the American government and I bet the British government, but maybe more in countries where there's no strong constitution and strong division of powers, maybe the president have more power. Let me just write that question down, guys. President Kennedy notoriously used his prestige as president to induce a large number of women to sleep with him, though since he was also handsome and rich, he hardly needed presidential prestige for that. It may be that, like the kinds of political groupie the Hungarian writer Artur Koestler talked about, some of them wanted to sleep with history. Such power is not a thing possessed by a power holder, but a moral relationship between the power holder and the person over whom the power is supposedly exercised, where it is a form of corruption. It involves the corruption of both powers. So I could stop any place, guys, but I feel like I just stop where I really think it's very important. So let's just continue. The fact that persuasion lies at the heart of politics have one central implication. The reason a politician decides upon a policy are categorically distinct from the reasons by which the public defends it. The two sets of reasons may overlap or they may not, but in either case, need we conclude that politics is a cynical business. The reason lies in what we may call the dimensions of a political act. I have to stop there, guys. This seems really important, so I'm just gonna pause and just ask you guys a question. One such dimension concerns the practicality of the act in question. Will it have to be the desirable effects expected of it? What are its costs and possibly long-term consequences? For the government to guarantee everyone an old age pension, for example, will certainly alleviate hardship, but it will also have economic consequences because the incentives to thrive and save will diminish, and that will affect the economy. The real test is long-term. As the 19th century journalist Walter Beirut observed, one cannot judge the consequence of any reform until a generation in which it was passed has left the scene. And I'll be reading Walter's book, The English Constitution, as well. That's definitely going to happen, guys, sometime in the future. So if you're like watching this, make sure to check that video out when I release it. So let's continue. Because it's very interesting. I was reading a little bit of the intro and what they were talking about. So, as second I mentioned, what is a consequence of pursuing this particular type of policy? It will infallibly become precedent used in arguing for further policies of the same type. If it fails, there may be demands that the policy be persuaded even further rather than abandoned. When the central direction of the economic activity produces anomalies, for example, the typical demand is that further central direction should be invoked to deal with the anomalies. Another dimension, what effect will this policy have on short and long-term prospect of its promoter? The promoter is here both an individual and party legislator legislating a policy. The welfare state, for example, created in Britain after 1945, diffuse benefits over the electorate, and its short-term effects might therefore have been to increase support for the Labour Party, which carried out. In the event this did not happen, Labour lost the 1951 election. More seriously still, some welfare measures of the period have been thought to have gentrified the working class and detached them from the Labour Party. As politicians say, nothing fails like success. So what he's saying is, like, when you introduce certain reforms, it might be that they backfire in the long term. Like with the Labour Party, they introduced some reforms and the working class sort of just abandoned them. A typical form of cynicism revolves around a concept such as public interest or the common good. It's easy to discredit such terms by pointing out that nearly every act of government will have both good and bad consequences for different sets of people, but it is to mistake the meaning of public interest to think it can be judged in terms of individual costs and benefits. Ideas of this kind are formal terms of political argument whose specific meaning can only emerge from the public debate itself. They are necessary formal conditions of any political advocacy. It would be absurd for a politician to say, I want to do this because it is good for me. Such a line would provide no reason with why anybody else would do it. No doubt there is a vague sense in which everything any political advocate is the best thing for him in the circumstances, but this does not mean all that he is a hypocrite out for nothing but his personal benefit. There is plenty of self-serving conduct in politics, though it is reasonable to think that politicians are generally more rather than less public-spirited than the rest of us. That may not be much, of course, but it is something. None of this is to deny the lowness of much of politics. A certain craftiness is essential. To know, for example, the rule whereby when votes are equal in a committee the motion is lost, tells a crafty politician whether to craft a precarious motion in negative or positive terms. For his opposing a policy, he frames it in positive terms, and the vote is tied, then the motion is lost, and he gets what he wants. In the 1994 Euro election in Britain, one candidate got thousands of votes from an unsophisticated electorate by calling himself the literal, rather than liberal democratic candidate. To have a name beginning with early letters of the alphabet gives a candidate a slight but measured advantage from the dimness of some citizens who simply fill in the ballot paper from top to bottom. And no one called Kennedy can fail to pick up some extra votes in many American states. The main delinquencies of politicians, however, arise from highly prevalent human vices. Cowardice in failing to challenge fashionable opinion, which a politician senses is wrong, fear of being thought stupid, desire to take up a virtue seeming posture, a preferable for a comfortable option, when the politicians know that chickens will come home to roost sometime after he has left the scene, and so on. Politicians from a kind of club sharing a culture in liberal democracies which cut across party division. Friendships, for example, are often warmer across parties than within them. Certain ideas, I'm going to stop there because I think that's interesting. Certain ideas are always dominant in this culture, and some of these ideas may run counter to the opinions known here as prejudices of the people at large. In recent times, capital punishment, multiculturalism, and international idealism are examples of this class of idea, and politicians sometimes confuse them with quite different things called principle. The significance of this fact is that certain respect politicians as a class of constitute an oligarchy whose tendency is at odds with that of the population. It rules. This oligarchic tendency is even more pronounced in countries whose electorate requires voters to support party lists. When the gap between what the politicians admire and what the people want widens, the general stock of politicians goes down, and they are recognized less as represented than as trying to hoodwink the people. The familiar ambiguities of politics become explicitly sophistry. This is of course a dangerous situation in which opportunities for demagogues multiply. The politician facing the question, how may my policy be commended to my audience, will think more of his audience than of his introspections. Sometimes the audience will be colleagues, sometimes his own party, and sometimes the electorate as a whole. We may assume that he is persuaded of its wisdom by the reason which seems decisive to him may well not be decisive to others. The problem of persuasion is to find the reasons that will be decisive to the audience. In doing that, the politician must take off whatever good common ground he shares with them. The first act of persuasion is for the persuader to convince his audience of his fellow feeling with their broader aims, and only then can he commend his own policy as something fitting in with those aims. What these accounts of persuasion suggest is that the politicians must be a special type of person, one capable of keeping his deepest convictions to himself. The rest of us can shoot off our mouth to our heart's content, indulging in a massive pleasure the modern world has invented, being opinionated about matters which we are ignorant. The politician must generally consider the effect of his opinions on his likely future and requires a special kind of personality structure. The politician must generally consider the effects of his opinions on his likely future and require a special kind of personality structure. But it should not be concluded from this that the politician is simply a hypocrite. Such person is engaged in a high-risk occupation in which he must always be looking for future development. Opportunism certainly part of the talent, but unless the politician has genuine convictions, both moral convictions and convictions about things are likely to move, he will lack the clear profile which is usually necessary for the greatest success. Statesmen, the highest grade of politicians, are those who balance inner conviction with the talent of turning every opportunity to advantage. That's very interesting, but let's continue. Charles de Gaulle called for resistance to Germany from London in 1940 and withdrew French politics in 1946, taking a risk in both cases which had doomed him to oblivion and insignificance. Churchill's stand against appeasement in the 1930s might have been more a mere swanson to a moderately successful career. A Barry Goldwater who took disastrous risk in bidding for presidency in 1964 turned out to be preparing the soil for the Reagan victory of 1980. The secret of politics is to care about success, but not too much. So guys, this is it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the questions on the sidebar, and then you guys, I hope you answer them down there. If it's your first time participating, it's a reading out loud, and I'm going to be leaving questions. I'll try to answer some of the questions as well and leave you guys others. But I'm really enjoying this, and let's just continue and not think too much about it. Alright, this is Lord a bit. Guys, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and answer the questions. See you in the next video.